There have been a couple of incidents in the recent past where a team has been accused of rule booking another team, that is, taking advantage of a rule infraction that one team committed by reporting it and getting them disqualified. I know this because each time it happens, the situation has blown up on Twitter with many of the same voices yelling about it. Its virality is far more important than the issue itself, elevating a personal dispute that should be between two teams and the tournament organizers to a community-wide discussion. And since it's always easy to figure out who's being discussed, the negative attention always has a really unhappy impact on the team being accused. I will not be sharing team names or player names, but there will be a couple quotations of what people have said. I won't be sharing where they came from, and you need to not harass anyone involved about any of this. The controversy has tended to center around a common rule against the use of the Alias feature. For those who don't know, when you join a private battle, the game gives you the option to use an alias, that is, change your in-game name to something else, in a way that makes you impossible to identify for sure, except by the fact that there's no discriminator next to your name anymore, and so it's at least known that you're using an alias. In theory, it's possible to check whether the player is using an alias by looking at someone's splash tag, but I'll also argue that it's understandable not to take the step to check when you're loading into a game and seeing their weapon comp for the first time. It's important for tournament organizers to know who's playing on which team for a couple reasons, some of which are more compelling arguments in support of the rule than others. For one thing, some players are banned from the community for behavior that threatens the safety of others, and these players will often try to infiltrate events using fake names so they can avoid the consequences of their actions. For another, some events are skill-capped, that is, only players below a certain level of skill are allowed to compete, and these events are sometimes attractive for short-sighted players of higher skill levels to try and sneak into and smurf in, that is, enjoying their ability to beat up on the weaker opponents. In theory, the rule exists to prevent both of these kinds of banned players from competing in tournaments. In practice, players have sometimes found ways around these rules and managed to enter anyway, but it is also incorrect, according to TOs I've spoken to, that these rules don't ever result in a player who shouldn't have been competing from being discovered, and it most likely also does have a deterrent effect in certain cases. That doesn't stop the Twitter mob from saying it's 0% effective. Sure, I'll buy that they've never heard of it working, but in situations where the rule works, it's not going to go viral. You're not going to hear about it unless you were involved. I'm not going to get too far into the mechanics of how people can or can't circumnavigate the rule. If I, as a teacher, tell a student I caught them plagiarizing their paper because the font changes partway through, indicating an obvious copy and paste, I'm not going to point that part out. I'm not going to be like, you thought I wouldn't notice if you just copied and pasted something in a different font? Come on now. That's just teaching them how to cheat better next time. In fact, it's emphasizing that they should have cheated better. I'm going to tell them I know that this isn't their own words and leave it at that because I'm here to get them to behave honestly in the future. The purpose for the rule is valid, and if it's going to be impactful even to an imperfect degree, and doesn't put an unreasonable burden on players, then in my opinion it's a rule worth having. In the situations I've seen, it's between teams where there's a clear skill imbalance, and the more skilled team was the one getting DQ'd. Another pattern is that the team getting DQ'd always starts by making really personal jabs at the other team after being DQ'd, specifically saying that they're bad at the game. Good luck in Gamma bracket, losers. This may or may not represent their current stance on the situation, but it is on the internet for me to have found, and it's pretty easy to delete or to decide in the first place not to call someone a loser on the internet. The theory that the accusers always seem to have by default in these situations is that the other team is hungry for results, hungry to keep competing in the tournament, to the point that they'd use every advantage at their disposal, including what they would call abuse of the rulebook, to get what they want. To me, the fact that this is the first explanation that comes to mind does not speak well of these players. I think it is emotionally unimaginative, unempathetic of them, to think that that's the most reasonable explanation for their behavior. Again, this has happened between teams that are not closely matched. No one in their right mind would take the DQ to mean that the team that makes the report should be seeded higher than their disqualified opponents in the next tournament. This has no benefit to the accused, except maybe getting one more match that day. In one case at least, it didn't even do that much. This will not get put on their Sendu profiles as a win. This is not a meaningful victory for them. I don't care that you were better at the video game on the day. If you broke a tournament rule that exists for a good reason, you are not above the rule just because you were better at the video game. Statements later get made by the accused explaining their rationales for reporting the infractions. Across multiple cases, I've found these rationales to be justified, not to mention supported by evidence TOs were able to provide, and they are never the same as the narrative that's created about them and spread virally in the first angry wave of Twitter dogpiling. In multiple instances, the DQ'd players got upset because the infraction was only reported after the deciding game of the set had been played. This, on its face, is a reasonable objection. If a team is able to play the set, see if they won the set or not, and then use the rule infraction that they otherwise wouldn't have cared about to get a free win in the case that it doesn't go their way, that not only allows for poor sportsmanship, but also delays the tournament unnecessarily for everyone else. If those 3 games didn't need to be played, no one wants them to be played, because there are matches further in the bracket to play, and some of us have work or school in the morning. In the Smash community, if you play a game out on a stage that's not supposed to be legal, that's on you, because it's your job to know the rules and to refuse to play and call a TO if they're not being followed. In Splatoon, while it's relatively easy to spot something like the wrong map mode being played, I don't think it's as reasonable to expect that most teams are checking splash tags every match. The map mode shows for the entire countdown on the weapon select screen. The stage in a Smash set is something you have to verbally agree to before it's chosen on the menu when the game starts. In Splatoon, you spend 90 seconds preparing for the match, talking with your team through the loading screen, game planning, and focusing, and the splash tag is only reliably shown at the moment you see the enemy team comp, and you have only seconds to process that new information before you're in mid trying to figure out how to fight it. You're not incentivized during that time to be looking for this rare infraction of the rules instead of figuring out how to outplay your opponents. If you make a habit as a team of delegating someone to look for it, it is possible to track, but that's not a widespread behavior right now. Most teams don't look for that in my experience. It's not a community norm yet. I have a lot more understanding for a team that doesn't notice this right away than I would for some other infractions. What's more, in at least one of those cases, some sources claim that there was no infraction until the final game anyway. On Splatoon teams, players sub in and out between games of a set sometimes, and it may only be in the deciding game that a player tried to enter who wasn't supposed to be there, or was using an alias. Maybe then, on the end screen, when you see their splash tags, that's the first time you notice that a player's tag is missing a discriminator. A stage in Smash or a map mode in Splatoon's a lot harder to miss at first than a single enemy player using an alias, and that's a barrier to enforcement that I'm not sure we should purely be holding the reporting players accountable for. Another common complaint is that in multiple cases of this happening, the player being reported for the alias usage has been simultaneously streaming, making it possible to confirm their identity in that way. Based on this, their team concludes, you can't tell them they weren't who they said they were. There's proof on a Twitch livestream that someone had to go and look up, hoping that the name of the stream would match their gamertag on Battlefy or start.gg. That's where you lose me on this objection. Do you really want to encourage your opponents in tournament to watch your stream during the match? Maybe they might go back and look at the game from their opponent's perspective later to try and learn from it, but they really shouldn't be looking into that for fairness' sake while the two teams are still opponents. In at least some, if not all, cases where the claim was made that they're streaming, you should have known it was them, it was tournament organizers who got called over to the situation after the dispute started who went and verified that, not the team that reported it themselves. Even if that happens and the player is cleared in the sense that we know who they are, that's still a very annoying step to have to take, because now the TO has to get involved, and that takes their attention away from the 100 things that they have to focus on in the rest of the event. It's what they're there to do, to manage these kinds of disputes, but the less work they have to do, the more likely the tournament runs on time. What if I told you that there's a much easier way to prevent this situation from occurring? What if this method of preventing a problem was easier and more reliable than expecting teams to check splash tags, and faster and less resource intensive than calling over a TO to show them livestream footage? I mean, I guess Nintendo could have designed a lobby system that took into account the needs of competitors, but if anything, that's the least likely of the three. There's a method by which the teams that got DQ'd for the infractions could have prevented themselves from those DQs. It's not to press the L button on this screen when entering a private battle lobby, or, failing that step, not inputting an alias from this screen. It's that easy. I understand why they sometimes do it. It's that someone's in-game name, once changed, is locked that way for 30 days. If you mess around with your buddies in the Anarchy Open and have your tag set to something silly and then a tournament comes up and you can't undo the silly, it can be tempting to just use the option that lets you correct that tag so it shows up on stream and the commentators identify you correctly. But at a certain point as a competitive player, if you are the kind of person who's hungry to be better known, hungry for results, hungry to be seen as a skilled player, you know, the kinds of people who are getting angry at being DQ'd out of a set they decisively won, you owe it to yourself to take care of your branding. You can't get your name out there if you have a different in-game tag at every tournament. People will not recognize you like that. No, they are not going to look carefully at your team's rosters and deduce by process of elimination which player is the one whose tag changed from one tournament to another. They're going to read the name that's on the screen and assume that's what they should call you, because that's what you decided to name yourself for the next 30 days. I wish Nintendo gave us the option to both mess around and express ourselves, but also have an official tag at tournament time, but they didn't. And we've known about that since the game launched, and there have been rules banning aliases since the game launched, one of which was clearly written in the official rules for the tournament that you entered. Man, at this point, you know you're breaking a rule when you press the L button, so take the L that comes with it. I switched teams recently, and I had to add my team tag to my name. So I did, because I haven't been team hopping so rapidly that I've been on multiple teams over the course of a 30-day period, and I was able to change my name. But I've even had a teammate who was on multiple teams at once at one point in time, and they didn't have a problem either, because all they did was leave the team tag off and play with their tag by itself. It's not an unreasonable ask of players that they not use the feature. There are ways around all of the problems that it can cause. Now, why should the other team report this if they know it's a minor infraction? Well, the first answer to that is that they didn't know whether it was a minor infraction for sure. Like we've mentioned, an alias infraction could be anything from a minor misunderstanding to a situation where someone's trying to evade a major splat safety ban. The TOs will be better able to investigate that than you, and ultimately it does sometimes fall to the players to remove plausible deniability and make it clear that they're here in good faith trying to follow the rules. So I blame absolutely no one that I've known to make a report on these grounds. But let's say it seemed to them like a minor infraction. There are sometimes rules put in place for reasons that organizers will know better than players will. In theory, the amount of time a team takes to ready up in a lobby is of no consequence to who's better at the game of Splatoon. If two teams are scrimming and want to take 20 minutes between each game, that's their prerogative and it doesn't say anything about who's better. But in a tournament setting, in such a large public event, tournament organizers need to make sure the tournament runs on time, to the point where if a match is taking too long, they need to hold the participants responsible for that and apply DQs against the offending team in case of delays. Sometimes, to the players, a rule might seem like something they don't have much of a stake in. Who cares if their pool set takes 40 minutes instead of 35? They may not know that the extra time they take compounds throughout the tournament, that in the next round, someone else taking 42 minutes makes it a 12-minute delay, and 4 rounds later, we're well behind schedule, and the TOs still have to seed the bracket, so really, if we could please just get it done in 30, that would be great. The blame for that will always fall on the shoulders of the TOs for not keeping the event moving, not the players who caused the delays. That hurts the health of the event as a whole, not to mention everyone's enjoyment of it. So the TOs have to be pretty strict with the players to hold them accountable so the tournament runs on time. If you want to help the event run smoothly, yes, you should weigh the value of the rule being enforced against the amount of time it takes to have a dispute and the amount of impact the infraction had on the match. But if it's in the rules, it's there because the TOs believe it's in the best interests for their event that it be in the rules. So when in doubt, it's worthwhile to bring up to a TO and get their ruling on it. There is always room to criticize the rules we hold each other to in this community. It's important to be able to do that. The rules should reflect community norms and promote community safety. If we come up with good reasons to criticize the rules and some tournament organizers aren't listening, then we need alternative tournaments run by organizers who will listen. But we didn't criticize this rule when it was written on Splatoon 3's release. We have only ever criticized it after the rule got our friends DQ'd out of bracket. Even if those criticisms hold water, I personally think the target of the negative emotions and the way they're expressed make it pretty clear that the objections are not coming entirely out of a desire for the tournament rules to be more reasonable. I think they're coming in part from the exact motivation the DQ'd players are falsely attributing to their opponents, that is, the desire to win and not lose. When they've addressed the situation publicly in these cases, they do not appear, in my view, to be acting as concerned citizens raising a community issue. That conversation starts and ends in the tournament feedback channel the vast majority of the time if it's good faith criticism. Even if it did make it through there, though, and the answer from the TOs wasn't satisfactory, secondly, it would have come out sounding more like, hey, I get that we broke the rule here, and we'll take the L for it, fair's fair, but I really don't think this rule is a big enough deal to be DQing teams over, and I'd like us to reconsider how strict it is for future events. Instead, what we're getting into on Twitter is, good luck in Gamma, losers. They are mad that they got DQ'd, and want their friends and people like them to sympathize with them about it on twitter.com. IPL, the tournament organization involved in the most recent incident, has since announced that they will no longer be applying the Alias rule to open entry tournaments, but will still be applying it to skill-capped tournaments. This is a compromise between the folks who think reporting this infraction is rule-booking someone, and the folks who think enforcing the rules is fine and normal. I would have stood by IPL if they had decided to stick to their guns and said, well, they broke the rules and that's the penalty for breaking the rules. But they've decided that these rules are what's best for their tournaments, and I trust them to know that better than I do. Whether that's because they actually find the rule to be ineffective, or just that they believe its efficacy doesn't outweigh the negative PR they've been getting over it and the move is political, I'm at no liberty whatsoever to say. I believe in the purpose for the rule, the spirit of the law, but maybe the letter of the law wasn't having the impact they wanted towards upholding the spirit of the law. That doesn't change the way the previous situations should have been ruled, to be clear, because as I've said before, as soon as an infraction of the rules hits the TO's desk, and there's no dispute that the infraction happened, if they don't enforce that rule, the rule no longer exists. Everyone gets to break it now. You can't pick and choose when to enforce the rule unless you have some kind of at TO's discretion verbiage. Something like may result in disqualification, softening the rule, and giving you that wiggle room. I have argued for using this kind of verbiage before, and maybe that would be a good compromise. But when you sign up for an event, you're making an implicit agreement with the organizers that you will follow the rules. And if you choose not to follow the rules as written, you are forfeiting your right to complain about them enforcing the rules. IPL is one of the biggest organizations we've got, and anyone who cares about the trajectory of the scene should be both supporting them and holding them to the highest possible standard. Because a lot of our public image, our tournament streams, the shows we put on for the world, are in their hands. I know their organizers have talked about this more thoroughly than just about anyone else amongst themselves, and I hope the conclusions they have come to will lead us in the right direction. But in this case, I personally don't think their critics are coming at the rule set with a clear mind and the best intentions. So I hope that it was a case of the organization finding good reason to do away with the rule, not a case of their hand being forced by negative PR from disgruntled players who had it within their power more than anyone else to avoid the situation in the first place.